Embattled but defiant, the United Kingdom's Prime Minister Gordon Brown says he won't waver or walk away despite the MP's expenses scandal. But how long can one man hang on when his ministers are resigning, his government is apparently crumbling and public opinion is increasingly turning against him? Gordon Brown, the expenses scandal and a political future in the balance. This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm Kamal Santamaria. He's a man who waited 13 years to get the top job and now faces the prospect of being one of the shortest serving prime ministers in modern British history. Gordon Brown, faced with a recession, his own dwindling popularity, and for some the ultimate fact that he simply ascended to the job. He never faced his people. The British Prime Minister is now dealing with mass resignations and revolt within his own party, all of which threaten to bring down his Labour government. Where did it all go so very wrong? Well, it's clearly one of those all of the above scenarios, but one incident in particular does stand out. Michelle Henry now on why an expenses scandal has taken the Brown government and politicians from right across the spectrum to the political brink.
For the last month, the British Parliament has been rocked to its Gothic foundations by a series of financial scandals. Small in monetary terms, but big and getting ever bigger in terms of the damage they are causing.
And we had no comprehension when we began this investigation of how much abuse we would uncover.
The Telegraph, Britain's best-selling broadsheet, broke the story and continues daily to publish revelations of MPs mired in the scandal.
Some people say the revelations are trivial because, for instance, we reported one MP had claimed for dog food on her expenses. Another MP claimed for a house for his ducks. Now, it may seem trivial, but to people in this country who are living through a recession with rising unemployment, it's not trivial at all. It's infuriating.
As British voters tighten their belts in the face of a global recession, the spending habits of their elected leaders have made for uncomfortable reading. Some of the expenses seem merely frivolous, while others appear downright greedy. Dennis McShane, a veteran Labour MP and ex-government minister, says the problem has been long in the making.
Successive prime ministers have refused to increase the pay for MPs. People felt that the allowances should help to supplement their salary, but unfortunately people have been claiming the allowances, frankly, in an abusive manner. We all accept that.
The fact that much of this was technically within the law does not necessarily exonerate the MPs when they are the ones that make the law.
They regulate themselves, MPs, they always have done, and they set their own expenses and they set their own salaries. It was a gentleman's club. That's how it was operating.
By Friday last week, more than a dozen MPs had resigned, including 6 cabinet ministers.
We would sneer at the problems the Italians have and the Greeks, and in Africa we would look at them and think, it could never happen here in Britain.
There is a lot of hypocrisy in the condemnation of corruption in the developing world, when in the developed world there are many examples of corruption.
Transparency International, which monitors corruption worldwide, says there is no room for complacency.
The sums that are involved may appear to be modest in relation to corrupt dealings in other parts of the world, but members of parliament should be exemplars of integrity. Let's not forget that members of parliament are referred to as the honourable members of parliament. The behaviour we have seen is less than honourable.
Although this is a cross-party issue, with MPs from the government and opposition having made questionable expense claims, it is the governing Labour Party which appears to be tearing itself apart over the crisis.
It is a cross-party issue, but Gordon Brown's party has suffered the most because they're the government, they've got more MPs, and people assume it's not a parliamentary problem, it's the government of the day's problem, because they expect governments to sort out problems, and I'm afraid this government didn't.
Time to go, Prime Minister!
The knives are now out for Prime Minister Gordon Brown. On Wednesday, the left-leaning Guardian newspaper, so long a supporter of the government, delivered a damning editorial, taking the unprecedented step of calling for Brown to go.
calls for him to go by newspapers and by right-wingers and by people who just don't have the respect of Labour MPs, if anything, strengthens his position.
But I don't think Gordon Brown's going anywhere, because the Labour Party in the opinion polls is way, way behind, and MPs don't want a general election because, just like turkeys don't vote for Christmas, they think they'd lose.
But it's not just the newspapers. Initial results in last week's European and local elections suggest that the scandal has had a devastating impact on the government and may point the way to a crushing defeat in a general election, which must be called within a year. There's a saying in this country that a week is a long time in politics. For the embattled Prime Minister, this month must feel like an eternity. The question remains, will he stay or will he go? And whether he does or not, will the reputation of the Mother of Parliaments ever recover from this scandal? Michelle Henry, Inside Story, London.
Right, so that gives you some good background to this whole story. Let's talk it all through with our guests. In London is Jeremy Corbyn. He is a Labour Member of Parliament for Islington North. He is joining us from there. Also in London, the veteran political commentator, Anthony Howard. And a bit further west, in Southampton, is Dan Hannan, a member of the European Parliament from the Conservative Party. He's also the author of something called The Plan, 12 Months to Renew Britain, which I'm sure we'll hear a little bit more about later on. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Anthony Howard, let me come to you first, not with a question, but with a statement, which I want to get your view on. Gordon Brown's position as Prime Minister is untenable. Rather than anything to do with his performance or the expenses scandal or the fact that he didn't face the voters or any of these things, just because of everything that has happened in the last few weeks, his position is untenable.
I don't agree with that. I think his position is obviously not an easy one, and it's a delicate one. But I think he can survive, and my own view is that he will survive until the next election, which I take it will be in either May or June of next year.
But let's flip it around then, and let's say he had an MP who had similar problems to him or who was being investigated for something or any of these sorts of things. That would put him in a position where he'd have to say, look, your position is untenable at the moment. I probably have to suspend you for a while until you're cleared of this, or whatever that type of thing might be. It's about being able to do the job effectively, and as long as the country is distracted by this at the moment, how can Gordon Brown do his job effectively?
Well, I think he is obviously in a much weakened position from when he came to power in succession to Tony Blair. And I'm not saying that his position is anything but a very difficult one. But if you say it's untenable, that's going further than I would go. I think that he can cling on. I think that he will be probably a weak leader of the nation. That won't be his own fault, but partly because of the conspiracy of circumstances that's come together. But my own view is that he can hang on, and in politics you never can tell what will happen next, and maybe something will turn up in his favour.
For sure. Dan Hannan, let's get your view from Southampton. Can he hang on?
Well, if Anthony Howard is right, it says nothing good about our political system or about the Labour Party. It's very clear to me constitutionally that he should go. I mean, I'm not the right person to ask whether he will, but he has no mandate, as you said in your introductory film. He's never faced an election. He chickened out of calling an election shortly after he became Prime Minister. He cancelled the referendum that he'd promised on the European Constitution. For an elected politician, he has a curious sort of allergy to the act of voting. And the economic crisis has rendered redundant now all of the manifestos on which the parties fought the last election. But much more important than any of that, we've had this parliamentary expenses scandal that requires a parliament with a fresh mandate, with genuine legitimacy from the electorate, to begin the overhaul, to begin the reform process. We've had the hubris and we've had the nemesis, but the catharsis is being artificially deferred as long as the Prime Minister and his team stay there.
Speaking of the expenses scandal, let's talk to Jeremy Corbyn about that. Obviously, the government has taken the biggest hit, it seems, because, quite simply, it is the government. Has it taken an unduly large hit, though? Because this is right across the spectrum, really.
It's taken a hugely disproportionate hit. Clearly, the expenses scandal is a scandal. Clearly, it's got to be sorted out, and additionally, it is being sorted out, and those MPs that have misclaimed, including David Cameron, are being forced to face up to the realities of what they were doing. But the idea that you should call a general election because of this, when the issue is being sorted out, is, I think, wholly fallacious. What we have is a crisis that's been generated by the scandal, yes, been exacerbated by the newspapers, and there's now a feeding frenzy of the media in Britain saying somebody has got to go and the Prime Minister must be got rid of. For example, 3 days ago they were saying there was an email circulating amongst MPs asking if they were prepared to sign it to say Gordon must go. Every newspaper led the front page saying that. I checked with a number of colleagues in Parliament. Nobody had ever seen or heard of this email. It may well exist somewhere, I don't know, but it seemed to be something that was more akin to one or two MPs talking to the media than any serious backbench movement.
What I would put to you, though, and I'm going to show these numbers to our viewers, unfortunately you won't be able to see them, but this is from a YouGov Sunday Times poll which was taken on March the 15th, which is of course well before this current scandal. These are the numbers. Only 3% of respondents thought Gordon Brown was performing very well as Prime Minister. 3% that is. 33 said he was doing fairly well. But then you've got this big chunk, 60%, who either went with fairly or very badly. I'll come back to you for this one, Jeremy Corbyn, because we are focusing obviously on what's happening right now and whether Gordon Brown should go right now, but the fact is his popularity was on the wane anyway.
Well, his popularity was very low at that time. I'm not sure exactly what it is today, but we don't have government by opinion poll. We have government by Parliament, and governments are supposed to be accountable to Parliament, and party leaders should be accountable to their members. Now, I have lots of disagreements with Gordon Brown, many disagreements on privatisation of the post office, the war in Iraq, and a whole lot of other things, but I'm not very comfortable with the idea that a few self-serving cabinet ministers who seem to be unrequited in their ambition should be allowed to dominate the headlines in order to push him out when they're offering no political alternative whatsoever. And I think that there's been, if anything, in the last couple of days, probably a bit of a swing back to Gordon amongst Labour supporters. I've been talking to people on the streets in London the last few days. No, they're not happy. Many didn't vote Labour on Thursday. Many would vote Labour in a general election, but they're a bit unhappy at the idea that a Prime Minister should be pushed out by this strange combination of an expenses scandal that's not of his making and a group of Labour MPs who feel that they ought to be doing something else and he hasn't given them the jobs they want.
So Jeremy Corbyn brought up the idea there of political alternatives. Let's ask Dan Hannan, who is from the Conservative Party, the opposition party, about political alternatives. The fact is, Labour's not going to go to the polls in its current state, so what are the alternatives?
I mean, I don't speak for my party. I've got an even looser relationship with my leadership than Jeremy has with his. But this goes way beyond partisan issues. I mean, the country, Jeremy knows this because he's been knocking on doors in the last 4 weeks like I have. The country wants and the Constitution demands an early dissolution. And I'm afraid the only arguments against an election are the self-serving arguments of politicians who fear that they will lose their seats and who want to keep their allowances and salaries flowing for another 12 months before they join the ranks of the unemployed. And it's exactly that kind of attitude that has discredited the political system and brought about this pass in the first place. I've no idea who's going to win the next election. I mean, obviously I hope it's going to be my party, but it's not really about, it shouldn't be about partisan manoeuvring. So how about this as a compromise, right? Instead of saying let's have an election tomorrow, let Labour change their leader, give them a chance to do that, to put them back in with a fighting chance. Let the new leader set out his plan for reform of the parliamentary expenses system and indeed for economic recovery, and then let's have an election no later than the beginning of September. And that, it seems to me, would be a way to give the country a fresh start so that we can begin a process of reform on the basis of MPs who have the mandate and the legitimacy of having been supported by their constituents.
Let's move on to another issue which has been raised by one of our guests, and that is the media coverage of this. Anthony Howard, let me ask you about this. The media, as we know, and perhaps I'm contributing to it right now with this program, but it has been relentless in pursuing this story, and some would say rightly so. However, is this skewing the British view of, I mean, how can the British people truly judge their leaders when they're being saturated like this with, let's face it, a great story?
Well, I think you're right in saying I can't remember a time in watching, 50 years now of British politics when any government has been so unanimously reviled in the press, anyway, as the Gordon Brown government has been over the past few weeks. Now, I lived through the Attlee government, 1945 to 50. There were very rough newspaper coverage of their doings. But this is the worst I've ever seen. And I think it's partly because the media smell blood. And when they smell blood, they become more and more, aggressive and more vicious. And I think, with the one exception, we have a popular paper called the Daily Mirror. The Daily Mirror, which is a long-time friend of the Labour Party, has been, I suppose, as balanced as it can be. But take The Guardian. The Guardian is the Bible of the sort of left-wing intelligentsia. And even that has called for the Prime Minister to go, and go at once. So it's not been a pretty sight. And I think this crisis has been much fuelled by the newspapers. Television, different matter.
I'm glad you said that, gentlemen. We've spoken a lot, obviously, about Gordon Brown himself, so it's only fair we allow him the right of reply, even if it is only on videotape. Here is just briefly the Prime Minister during a recent news conference in London, defending his position and himself.
I accept responsibility, but I'm not going to walk away from our duty to the country. I'm going to get on with the task. Now, what people want us to do is three things. It's clear from what people are saying, and it's clear from what I believe, that we've got to clean up politics. It's clear also from what people are saying and what I believe that we've got to take this country through the economic recession. And it's clear also that we've got to show people that the future, particularly the future of our public services, is one that people can have confidence in when they have more control over these services themselves.
Jeremy Corbyn, there's the Prime Minister speaking quite rightly about big issues, about recession and about fixing public services. But I go back to, I think it was the first question I asked to Anthony Howard. How can he do that now with all this distraction and with all this media exposure, and it is turning people against the Prime Minister? How can he focus on those things, which is what he's supposed to be doing?
He can do that by making very strong statements in the next few days, starting tomorrow at the Parliamentary Labour Party, saying what he's going to do to protect jobs during the recession. Hopefully he's going to drop this nonsense of part privatisation of the post office, and that we will move forward on policies about protecting people against this slump, regenerating inner city areas, more housing, and a whole lot of issues. Don't run away with the idea that just because the media are absolutely obsessed with Gordon Brown's head, ordinary people on the streets feel the same way. They don't. All the questions I had over the past few days were mainly about all the sort of things that people always ask questions about: the state of the health service, education, housing, all those kind of issues. That's what they wanted to know about. Parliamentary reform of the expenses is obviously crucial. As I said before, that is happening. There also, I think, needs to be a strengthening of the role of Parliament, and Gordon, to his credit, did hint at this a year ago, that he was prepared to look at changes in the Select Committee system, greater scrutiny of Parliament, Parliament having a degree of vote over ministerial appointments and things like that, empowering Parliament. That surely is the right way forward, and I think these things could change very, very quickly. But Anthony Howard is right. There is a media obsession of baying for blood at the present time.
And Dan Hannan, to be fair to Gordon Brown, he was succeeding with some policies, with dealing with the recession. His plan to save the banks was critical last year. People have just got too short a memory, perhaps.
Well, under the rules we have in this country, it's the voters who ultimately decide these things. I mean, nobody would disagree with the broad objectives that you just showed Gordon Brown setting out, of cleaning up the system and getting us through the recession and so on. You know, you'd have to be a lunatic to be against that. The problem is that it's also clear, which he didn't add, that he lacks the moral authority to begin this task. His association with those objectives will almost of itself prejudice their achievement. I agree very much with what Jeremy Corbyn just said about the need to strengthen Parliament, to shift power from the executive to the legislature, and indeed from the legislature to the people. I think there are lots of ways you could do that. But this is not the Parliament to do it. Given the standing that Parliament now has in the country, they wouldn't be trusted to begin that work. Now, I'm not saying that all MPs are guilty of wrongdoing. Far from it. Most of them are not. Most of them have acted with great patriotism and with scrupulousness. But those who are going to come back need the mandate of a fresh election so that they have explicit authority to begin a task on this scale.
Gentlemen, as you will of course know, late last week there were local elections held across England, and in short, Labor took a hammering. We're just going to have a quick look at those numbers. 34 local councils were up for grabs. The opposition Conservative Party, absolute landslide, 30 was their majority. The Liberal Democrats managed to hang on to just one. But all of this that's happening in the government has clearly affected Labor. The ruling Labor Party, no councils, only minority seating. in the councils and with no overall control. Anthony Howard in London. Two questions related to that. A, was it heading that way, do you think, regardless of this scandal? And B, is that an indication, do you think, of what would happen if a general election were to be held very soon?
I think things were heading that way anyway. You know, this government has won 3 elections on the trot, and you always get into trouble, it seems to me, when you come to the end of 10 years or whatever it may be. I think it's 11 years now, if not 12. And so I think there was bound to be a unsuccessful election for the incumbent government. How far it was fuelled by the row over MPs' expenses, I don't know. I mean, in any just or fair world, that row would involve all candidates of every party, because it wasn't a one-party scandal. It was a scandal about what everyone had got up to in the House of Commons and indeed in the House of Lords. So it's a little bit unfair that Labour should be taking the rap for it. But I think in a strange way people do think. They think that if you're the government in power, then it's your fault. And therefore my suspicion is, and I can't prove it, but my suspicion is that this row over MPs' expenses did probably cost Labour quite a number of additional seats. And they might have held on in 1 or 2 of those county authorities, only 4 of them that they controlled, but for this latest row. I think that it did actually cost them quite a lot of support.
And if we took this latest row out of the equation, I know it's difficult to do that, especially in light of how big it's become, but if we took it out of the equation, where was Labour?
Well, I think Labour would not have done well in any circumstances. I mean, whatever the government in power is, it tends, when it's coming, you know, it's been there some time, not to do well in local elections. And Labour governments have done very badly before. Of course, I suppose the thing that the Conservatives have to be a bit sort of, a little bit sort of chastened by is that they didn't do all that well themselves, especially in such idealistic conditions. They got, I think it was it 38% of the vote? Well, that was down 6% on what they got 4 years ago, and it wasn't, I mean, although it was a terrible slaughter night for the Labour Party, it wasn't a tremendously successful night for the Tories, and on the basis of those results, they probably wouldn't get an overall majority in the House of Commons.
Gentlemen, we're running down the clock here, so just a couple of quick final questions. Jeremy Corbyn, when, in your opinion, will Gordon Brown face the voters?
Next year, probably May or June, and I think that we'll see a pretty intensive early summer and autumn period of parliamentary changes and hopefully some real action on protecting jobs and people's lives in the recession. Don't forget, Conservatives lost local authorities by the bucket load in the 1980s and early 1990s and still won the 1992 general election.
Dan Hannan, quick final word from you. You've got 30 seconds left. When do you think the next election will happen?
It'll happen at the last minute. He'll cling on as long as he can. I mean, of course, it should happen now. This is getting, you know, they've just brought out a new Terminator film, but I'm reminded of the end of the first one, where however often you blast the wretched thing, the red lights go on in its eyes and it keeps clawing its way forward. Labour is now down to a share of the national vote below that which it has enjoyed since it became one of the major mainstream national parties in the 20s. You know, half the MPs are refusing to serve. We have a cabinet that's now stuffed with unelected officials because there are no elected representatives to take government jobs. And he still won't get the message. He's still clawing the charred husk forward through the orange flames. There comes a point when the country has just had enough.
Gordon Brown, Terminator or terminated? We will find out. Thank you to our guest Jeremy Corbyn in London, Dan Hannan in Southampton, and also Anthony Howard in London. Gentlemen, great discussion. Thank you. And to you, our viewers, thank you for joining us for Inside Story. You can send comments and suggestions on the email insidestory@aljazeera.net is our address. From the whole team, though, it's goodbye for now.